The first setting we'll be taking a look at is anti-aliasing. Anti-aliasing smooths out jagged edges inside the game to give you a lot better looking image and a more smooth looking image where you won't have all those sharp edges around different items in the game. As always, I tested this in 3 different resolutions, in 4K, 1440p and 1080p. And the reason for that is that the recommendation will sometimes depend on your resolution, because usually the higher resolution you are running, the less you actually need anti-aliasing because of that high resolution. If we first take a look at 4K, I couldn't notice any noticeable difference between having this on low or having it on high, even while zoomed in. Therefore, I would simply just leave this at low and maybe save 1% performance. If we then take a look at 1440p, the story is actually the same. And once again, I would just recommend to leave this at low because I couldn't see any noticeable difference between any of these 2 options. And lastly, if we take a look at 1080p, once again, I would simply just recommend to leave this at low because I couldn't find any noticeable difference, which is a bit unusual compared to the other games I've tested. But no matter what resolution you're playing, I would simply just recommend to leave this at low. Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my video. Today we're taking a look at Halo Infinite, where we'll analyze all the different settings to see how they compare in terms of FPS and quality. And lastly, I'll show my own optimized settings that I recommend. If you have any suggestions for future games you would like for me to analyze, feel free to write them in the comments below. I wanted to showcase the 2 extremes of all low and all ultra to see both the performance but also the quality difference between the 2. There's a few points I want to mention before we move on to the next setting. Firstly, a large majority of the settings in this game does not have an impact on either your performance nor the quality, which I did find a bit odd. Secondly, because of the first point, the difference in quality between all low and all ultra is therefore very small. Lastly, I also want to mention that this game has a very interesting setting called async compute, which I've never seen before and which I'll cover more later in the video. As you can see in the video, there is a 30% difference in performance between all low and all ultra, so we have a lot of headroom we can work with, so let's get started. Now let's take a look at texture filtering. Texture filtering, also known as anisotropic filtering, improves the sharpness of textures, especially those that are either seen at an angle or at a distance from the player. In my testing in Halo, I have not been able to find any place where this has any noticeable either quality or performance difference. Therefore, I would simply recommend to just leave this at low, because you're not gonna miss out on any graphics from doing so. Next up, we got ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion adds some extra soft shadows to small crevices and to places where you have 2 objects that are very close to one another. Ambient occlusion will add a lot of extra shadows, which can in return improve the overall visual quality of the image. In my testing of Halo Infinite, I have not been able to find a single location where this actually seems to make any noticeable difference. And that's both in terms of performance, but also in terms of quality. Therefore, I would once again simply recommend to just leave this at low, because you're not gonna be missing out on any noticeable visual change. Now let's take a look at texture quality. Texture quality controls the detail of the textures in-game and thereby also the resolution of these textures. So the higher you go, the sharper and more detailed your image will be. This can also have an effect on pop-ins, where if you choose a higher option inside this setting, you should be able to avoid most of, if not all, pop-ins, because you will already have the textures loaded into your VRAM. And therefore, the biggest factor for determining which option you should choose is also your VRAM usage. How much VRAM you have available, because this will rarely, if ever, make any difference on your actual performance, on the actual FPS you're getting. To figure out how much VRAM you have available, I would actually recommend to just use the VRAM usage tool or image, or whatever you want to call it, that they show you while you're changing your video settings. Because in that they also have an ideal. So as long as you are below your ideal VRAM usage, then you're fine. Therefore, I would recommend to set texture quality as high as you possibly can within your VRAM usage. Next up, let's take a look at geometry detail. Geometry detail will add some extra details to the geometry, to the complexity of the world, the graphics of the world, to make it look a lot better, but also to help reduce pop-ins of different graphics. In my testing, however, I have not been able to find any noticeable difference, both in terms of pop-ins and also just in terms of the general quality of the game. This might make a difference in single player though, because you have a much bigger world you're traveling around in, where you might actually see a difference in terms of the pop-ins. But in multiplayer at least, I've not been able to find any noticeable difference. Therefore, I would simply recommend to just leave this at low. Now let's take a look at reflections. Reflections control the amount of and the detail of the reflections inside the game. These reflections can appear on different reflective surfaces, such as water or shiny metal. In my testing, however, I have not been able to find any noticeable quality difference between any of the 5 options. Even when we supposedly turn them off, you can still see them, and they still look great. I did, however, find a fairly large performance difference between these 5 options, up to 12% actually. Therefore, I would highly recommend to just leave this at off. Now let's take a look at depth of field. Depth of field will blur all the other areas except the very one that's in focus. So in my testing, I've tested this by aiming at the center of the screen with my pistol, and then I'm showing you guys the right side of the screen to see if we can see any noticeable blurriness appearing. In my testing, however, I have not been able to find any noticeable blurriness, if you can call it that, appearing on the right or left side of the screen while aiming down the side. And as you can see, I have exactly the same performance between low, medium and high. So it doesn't seem to actually do any noticeable difference in this game. And therefore, I would simply recommend to just leave this at low. Next up, we got shadow quality. Shadow quality controls the quality of the different shadows inside the game. In my testing, I hardly found any difference between these 4 options. The only difference I actually found was that the shadows got slightly darker as you turned up the setting. But this is such a small difference that I doubt anyone would actually notice this while being in-game. If you combine that with the fact that you actually can lose up to 10% of your performance from this setting, I would highly recommend to just leave this at medium, because between medium and low you don't lose any performance and the shadows look slightly better. Next up, we got lighting quality. Lighting quality controls how far away different light sources will lit up. In my testing, this does not seem to have any impact on your performance. And the only quality difference I found was this small light source that was not lit up while I had it on low and medium, but only while I had it on high and ultra. Therefore, since it doesn't seem to have any performance difference, and since it might be an easy way to avoid some light pop-ins, I would recommend to just leave this at ultra. Now let's take a look at volumetric fog quality. Volumetric fog quality controls the quality of the fog inside the game. In my testing, I have not been able to find any difference both in terms of quality, but also in terms of performance. At least not in the multiplayer. This might be one more of those settings that might actually make a difference in terms of the single player, where they've been talking a lot about their dynamic weather system. But in the multiplayer at least, this does not seem to make any difference, and therefore I would simply recommend to leave this off. Next up, we got cloud quality. Cloud quality controls the quality of all the different clouds inside the game. In my testing, I have not been able to find any noticeable difference either in quality or in performance. Therefore, I would simply recommend to just leave this at low. Now let's take a look at dynamic wind. Dynamic wind controls the complexity of the wind inside the game. In my testing, I have not been able to find any noticeable difference both in terms of quality, but also in terms of performance. However, this is one of those settings that might have a bigger difference in the single player, so that is something to look out for. In the multiplayer, however, I have not been able to find any difference, and therefore I would simply recommend to just leave this off. Next up, we got ground cover quality. Ground cover quality controls both the density but also the distance for rendering foliage, rocks, and generally on all other small objects in the game. In my testing, however, I have not been able to find any noticeable difference both in terms of quality but also in terms of your performance. Therefore, I would simply recommend to just leave this at low. Next up, we got effects quality. Effects quality controls the quality of the different effects inside the game, such as explosions. In my testing, I have tried to simulate this by throwing a lot of grenades. While doing so, I didn't find any noticeable performance difference. However, it should be said that I can only create a limited amount of explosions at one time. So if you're in a very chaotic server or in a very chaotic scene with a lot of explosions going on, it might have a bigger impact or just generally have an impact on your performance. I did, however, find a small difference in quality between the 4 different explosions. I'm just gonna freeze the frame here so you can actually see it, because it can be quite difficult to notice it while it's just going on. As you can see, there is a difference in the particles between low and medium, but after we hit medium, there's not that much of a difference between medium, high and ultra. Therefore, I would recommend to use medium, because should there be any performance difference in very chaotic scenes, then it shouldn't hit you as hard if you're only using medium, and you're not going to be missing out on any quality difference after medium anyways. Now let's take a look at decal quality. Decal quality controls the quality of the different decals in the game, so that could be something like bullet holes or footprints. So the higher the option you choose, the longer the bullet holes or footprints and so on will stay in the game. As you can see here in my example, once we go up higher, up towards high, the bullet holes and the shells will stay for a much longer time compared to while we have it on low. In my testing, I didn't find this to have any noticeable performance difference. The same can be said for my second example here, where I wanted to see if it would make any difference in terms of footprints. As with bullet holes, this does not seem to make any difference in performance. However, with footprints, I also didn't notice any difference in the quality and how long the footprints would appear on screen. Therefore, I would just recommend to leave this at high, since you'll be able to see bullet holes for much longer, which might help you in game. Next up, we have animation quality. Animation quality will control the quality and smoothness of the character animations in game. So this will not affect your own character, but it will affect all the other characters you see. Inside this setting, we have 2 options to choose from, either auto or max. Auto will set the quality based on your CPU, so based off your hardware, where max will just set it to the maximum quality no matter what hardware you have. In my testing, I didn't notice any immediate quality difference in the character animations between the 2 options. However, that might just be because auto saw that my CPU is fairly powerful, so it just set it to the max anyways. I can't really know that. Therefore, it's a bit difficult for me to compare the 2 and how it would actually look if you had a less powerful CPU. Therefore, I would recommend to just leave this at auto and let the game decide what is best for your hardware. Also, because if you have really good CPU, then it's gonna put it to the max anyways. And if you have a poor CPU, then it might help you save some performance or some stutters and so on from something you probably won't even notice anyway, since it is character animations. Now let's take a look at terrain quality. Terrain quality enables higher detailed terrain in the game, especially when you are at a further distance away from it, and therefore can help reduce pop-ins. In my testing in the multiplayer, I did not find any noticeable difference, both in terms of quality but also in terms of performance. However, it is worth mentioning that it might have a bigger difference in the single player, where you have a much bigger world, but this setting might actually help reduce pop-ins. Otherwise, if you're just playing the multiplayer, I would just recommend to leave this at low. Next up, we have simulation quality. Simulation quality controls the vehicle suspension systems and the vehicle audio in this game. The higher you go, the more CPU you will consume, at least according to the game. In my testing, I didn't find any noticeable difference in terms of CPU usage between the 4 options. However, that might be different if you have a less powerful CPU. In terms of the actual quality of the vehicle suspension systems and the vehicle audio, I didn't notice any difference either, and therefore I would simply recommend to just leave this at low. Now let's take a look at flocking quality. Flocking quality controls the quality of the animations for the different animals inside the game. It can also control whether or not you are able to see those animals, where you have 5 options to choose from, where the first one is where you can actually completely turn them off, so you won't be able to see any of the birds, chickens, fish and so on in the game. In my testing, I didn't find that big of a difference in terms of both performance but also quality between these 5 options. The biggest difference I found was between low and off, where off you completely turn it off like I said and you remove all of the animals, and low you add them back into the game. Between low and ultra I couldn't see any difference either in amount of animals inside the game but also in terms of their animations. Therefore, I would recommend to choose either off or low, based on whether or not you like to have these animals in the game or not. Next up we got async compute. Async compute is probably the most interesting setting inside Halo Infinite. Async compute is a feature from DirectX 12, which allows more work from the GPU to be run in parallel, so the different engines can be used more effectively. Basically, it lets the GPU become a lot better at multitasking, and therefore be able to better utilize its resources. I know earlier in the process with Halo, some AMD GPUs had some issues with this, where it would actually make the game crash quite a lot, but as far as I know, this should have been fixed by now. And as you can see, at least with my GPU, I gain around 10% performance just from enabling this with no downsides whatsoever. Therefore, I would highly recommend to try to enable this and see if you gain some benefits as I did. Because if you do get crashes, then of course turn it off, but otherwise it's just free extra performance you get. Here are my own recommended settings, which are based off the recommendations I have made throughout the video. Do keep in mind that you have to adapt texture quality based on the amount of VRAM you have available. And here is a chart of the top settings inside Halo Infinite, which has a percentage difference on performance above 5%. And this really shows how few settings actually make a difference in terms of performance in the game, since I could only find 3 settings where the performance difference would actually be above 5%. And here is the live showcase of my recommended settings stacked up against all low and all ultra. With the recommended settings, we were able to get 23% more performance compared to all ultra, while still having the game look great. But thank you all for watching. If you made it this far and have been able to use this video to get better FPS in Halo Infinite, please like and subscribe for future videos where we'll take a look at other games. If you had any feedbacks on the videos or any other tips or tricks to get more FPS in Halo Infinite, please share them in the comments below. If you're interested in these kinds of videos, maybe check out the video I made on Apex Legends. Have a nice day. Bye bye.